Alright YouTube, it's time for a video that I had intended to make for some time and I had never bothered to upload it. But because I've been talking to some self-proclaimed Marxists or communists or collectivists or communalists or whatever they're calling themselves nowadays, I figured it was finally time to explain specifically at depth in a video why I oppose communism and all of the umbrella terms associated with it, why I oppose it as an economic ideology, a political and social ideology, whatever form it happens to take. And it boils down to 6 basic rudimentary observations about communism that are fairly straightforward. You could boil it down even further and just say, well, communism didn't work because it was never properly implemented, but that's just one part of it. I wanted to go a little bit deeper. So the first point is that communism as an ideology, whether you're talking about the economics underlying the philosophy itself or whether you're talking in more social terms, the idea of Marxism itself, as per Karl Marx in his own statements on communism, are based off of his armchair anthropologist understanding at the time in the 1800s of the human condition in antiquity. That is, sort of before the Roman period. Back then, their time scales were off and they didn't have much of an idea really about what primitive man was like. And the idea that he had was primitive communism. The idea that mankind, before sort of the empire's period, lived in a condition that was communal in nature. They shared and shared alike. They had no concept of specifically self-ownership of anything. They had a concept maybe of group ownership. They had the concept of reciprocity, which is true, but it was sort of a selfless reciprocity, sort of, just across, trading across from one another, and that was basically all they had. Their idea of personal ownership of goods or anything else was limited at best, and they were essentially what he defined as communists. This has been completely and utterly, totally disproven by modern archaeology alone, if not by basically every field of science. If we look back at mankind's early history, we're not seeing communalism. We see they had a great deal of understanding about personal ownership. You see this even 9,000 years ago in the ruins in Syria, for instance. While you have a communal style living structure, although it's sort of arranged into a self-contained single building city of sorts, each individual dwelling has certain goods and things in it that obviously had personal importance and personal ownership attached to them. The hearth for cooking, the washing basin or whatever, and even the remains of ancestors, which also shows, as opposed to his beliefs on religion, these primitive people already had some sort of spiritual views. They disinterred the dead regularly and drew all over these bones and washed the bones and did all sorts of things with the bones. They had a structure which exhibits features of lineage-based tribalism. That is, their bloodline, their descendants and ancestors were of importance to them in some way. We see this with the Neanderthal burials. The idea, if these people had no concept of personal ownership, why do we find Neanderthal burials from over 10,000 years ago, in which belongings, presumably of a personal nature, are buried along with these skeletons of these Neanderthals? And this isn't even, we're not talking about modern humans, we're talking about what is generally considered, I have my own feelings on this, but a proto-human hominid. The fact is, if Marx had waited about 40 years before publishing his nonsense, he would have realized that his theory was completely and utterly wrong. And because the underlying basis of the rest of his theoretical works is flawed, it takes on the aspect of ridiculousness to even take them seriously. The underlying basis upon which he himself created and manufactured his ideology was incorrect. We know it to be incorrect. We can prove that it's incorrect by looking back at primitive man and find the central underlying facet which led him to the rest of his theories is not true. Another problem that I have with communism is that there's no seemingly solid definition of communism. It's sort of, and I have this same problem with religious zealots. I'll point out something that religious zealots of a certain type have done wrong. For instance, I'll say, well, Christianity killed millions and millions of people back during the Dark Ages. There were the Crusades, and then there were Christian colonialists, and Native Americans died, and they enslaved people, did all these horrible things. And the Christians, what they typically tell me, and the Muslims do this too, and I point out their wars and butchery, and imperialism and expansionism. Oh, well, that's not correct Christianity. It's not true doctrinal Christianity. You see, they've simply interpreted it differently. I get the same feeling from communists when I try to talk about communism many times. You will point out something that has been done in a self-proclaimed communist regime, and they will say, well, that wasn't really communism because X, Y, and Z. And it all becomes a bit nutty because you have various regimes throughout history which have turned themselves communist, which have more or less acted in a communalist effort, which devolved mostly into totalitarianism. Tito's Yugoslavia is about the best example of a sort of a far-left regime that actually worked for a while, and apparently he assassinated Joseph Stalin himself after he got tired of Stalin trying to assassinate him, which is pretty fucking funny. You try to point these failed regimes out and say, well, Stalin, he proclaimed himself to be communist. All of these different, Mao was a communist, Pol Pot's a communist. And they'll say, well, they weren't really communists because, and then they'll go on to a laundry list of reasons why it doesn't fulfill their version, I guess, of legitimate doctrinal communism. It begins not to make sense when you point this out. Number 3 would be simply that same sort of feeling, like that communists act an awful lot like religious zealots. And it goes beyond, by the way. It goes beyond merely sort of moving the goalposts and saying, oh, well, that wasn't real communism, this is real communism as we interpret it now today, and, learn from your mistakes, and communism can work, it just hasn't been given a chance, and it goes beyond all of that and goes into almost a religious realm on the basis of the obsessive behavior of communists to engage in certain types of political debate and drag their balls across everybody's face, whether they are or not wanted in that debate in the first place. Which isn't, I do that too with religious individuals, so I'm not going to be a hypocrite on that, per se. But at the same time, the views which they concoct, sometimes you'll talk to two different communists from, I guess, slightly different groups, and they'll come to a completely different conclusion on a topic. One group might say, well, guns shouldn't be allowed, eventually imperialists will use the guns and they'll take back over, so a communist regime can't have firearms, and another will say, no, everyone should have them because, communal whatever, and you get all these different weird opinions. It makes it somewhat difficult to have an intelligent conversation with someone that proclaims themselves a Marxist or a communist when you can't actually get a straight answer on these issues. There are other political movements that are relatively straightforward, at least on many of the issues which they involve themselves with. Communism does not appear to share this facet, and the communists are guilty, by the way, of the same thing they whine about others doing. You try to talk to a communist about libertarianism, and they will immediately strawman it and construe it as though you're advocating rule by corporations, which is not the case. It has nothing to do with the actual definition of libertarianism as used now or in the past. They're thinking of objectivism, which is not exactly the same. And then they will go completely apeshit if you point out, but actual communists in the vein of Marx himself said X, Y, and Z, and there was this failure and this policy was a bunch of bullshit, and they'll say, no, that's not real communism. It's very confusing. Number 4, simply look at history. It failed. All of these communist regimes failed. Now, importantly, the new wave of communists are so fond of claiming, oh, but real communism was never actually implemented. Okay then, let me for a second indulge you and say that I agree with you. Okay, real communism has never actually existed in the world. All sorts of other things have, but real communism never did. Okay, let's indulge you for a moment. Why is it that if communism is such a self-evident philosophy, if it's so good and positive and it works fairly well and it's desirable and it's innate even to human nature as Marx believed, if all of these things are true, why is it that communism is never even properly implemented? It's such a failure that it doesn't even get a chance to fail on its own. It never even gets implemented before it turns into some bastardized form of totalitarianism. Then we have to observe the difference between pragmatism and idealism. The communists are idealists. They want this system to work. They believe it will lead to utopia. Okay, maybe so. But from a pragmatic viewpoint, does it work? Is it actually possible to implement such a system? So far, in many, many decades, it hasn't been the case that it has. You look at states which still proclaim themselves communistic, they all appear to be relatively isolated, states. They're not doing too hot. Those that open up to the Western world, often suddenly they start to improve. Well, I wonder why. Number 5 would be simply the communists themselves. I'll even go ad hominem here. Most communists that I've ever talked to have been Apple-using trust fund hypocrites. That is, that people will buy their Che Guevara shirt at Walmart. People are using a $2,000 Apple laptop to complain about capitalism. How does this make any sense at all? You're actually participating in the same system that you are telling others you believe is cancerous, vile, imperialistic, hate-filled, bigoted, and everything wrong with the world. Well, why would you want to participate in such a system? There are self-proclaimed communist nations you can go to if you're into that sort of thing. Short of that, you don't need to engage in active commerce in a capitalistic sense. Go and get your acre of land and make your own sunflower oil in your own clothes on your own loom and so forth. If you obtain the skills to do that, it is, by the way, possible to do so. Beyond, paying your taxes or whatever, I guess you can be a communist if you want. You don't have to buy anything from any store. Nobody has compelled you to do so. You can own the means of production on your own. The problem is your products that you create, other than a few, like organic food's great, organic homemade soap is great. Other than that, you're probably going to end up with a substandard product that you yourself will not like. Try designing your own computer without using any capitalistic made components. I think you'll run into a little bit of a problem. Which explains, again, these people, I call them Starbucks Marxists. That is, they sit in Starbucks and they swill their capitalist coffee and they use their capitalist iPhone to rant about capitalism, while they wear their capitalist Che Guevara shirt from Walmart, manufactured in India using products that were originally sourced from Africa by a bunch of child slaves. It's hypocrisy at its finest. And so I tend not to even take them seriously on their face. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Your communist flag was probably made in a capitalistic country. Well, there's the ultimate irony for you. All of your commie paraphernalia, from your shoes on up, was made by capitalism, and you appear unable to comprehend this simple fact. And number 6, it overlooks human nature. As I said, humanity strives for wealth. But it goes beyond wealth. Money and wealth and all these things are just modern day extensions of the same general principle of value. It's not about wealth. It's not about wealth you can hoard and paper money you can exchange for goods and services. We've got to leave behind that when we're talking about proto-human ancestors of modern man. There is an intrinsic value to certain things in this world. Even apes understand the intrinsic value of a stick capable of fitting inside a termite mound so that they're capable of getting a protein-rich, tasty snack. And if you try to take the termite stick from them, they're probably going to rip your arms off. They have an intrinsic view to the value of that object. Why? Do they think they can trade it for money? Do they comprehend the notion of trading it for a banana? No, but they know that it has some intrinsic value and use, and they use it for themselves. They may get around in a group and cooperate to get the termites, but at the end of that stick, those termites are largely theirs, unless they're, I don't know, giving it to the monkey they happen to be mating with. It's an intrinsic value system. Apes show this. Other animals show this. Dolphins use pufferfishes to get high. They understand that there's some value that goes beyond I've got to eat it or I've got to have sex with it, which is often, I think, how we think of animals. The idea of betting among some of the great apes. Well, if the other ape comes along and tries to sleep in the bigger gorilla's little nest, do you think that he's going to tolerate it? No, he's going to grab the other gorilla and hurl him out of the tree and probably crack his skull on a rock. This is innate to the hominid branch of our lineage. And it's even more potent among humans. We developed a larger mental capacity fairly early on, an increased cranial capacity, the ability to reason and understand. The concept of increasing one's standing is innate to the human race. And even the idea of trading our stature or our wealth in some way for goods or services is also innate. Communism has failed specifically because it is antithetical to human nature. Above all else, if you ignore everything else about communism, the only observation you need to make is simply because it is antithetical to human nature, it cannot work. It will degrade, corruption will seep in, people will skim something off the top, officials and peasants and everybody will be corrupt. They will seek to hold back just a little bit more for themselves, and this is how the system falls in on itself. When times are good in communist land, everything's fine. The second that a localized famine hits, the system begins to break down. And it is not in order for communism to succeed, it would have to remove from humankind not just the facets of wealth that we use today. You could eliminate the concept of currency and go back to direct trading. You could eliminate the concept of stockpiling goods and live on a yearly basis. You could eliminate machining. You could go back to living like how the Amish live. Or even before the Amish, you could go back to living like cavemen and have a communist society. It still wouldn't work. You would have to remove the deeply ingrained concept of value, which is a survival mechanism, from the human gene pool, from the human volition, from our psyche. It's not possible to do so. You would literally have to turn yourself into hominids that would mentally resemble ants in order to get it to work. It won't work. It's not possible to do. Communism barely even needs to be refuted because it's self-refuting both by its membership, which tend to be hypocrites, on the one hand, and also the fact that anyone with a rudimentary understanding of anthropology and biology understands the way that evolution works upon culture. So communism can't actually function. It's incapable of working. Human beings strive to compete. Competition is the driving force behind capitalism. I've tried to explain this to people. People who are self-proclaimed communists often think that capitalism is corporate rule, the same as they think for libertarianism. To them, anything other than communism is ruled by corporations or a dictator for some reason, despite the fact that dictators and their business partners typically ruled communist regimes more effectively than those that were not. And a greater deal of wealth was maintained, by the way, by those that were either elites or usually in the military, because those are the ones that you have to appease to control the 90% of the population that is considered the little guys, the peasants, you know, and so forth. But no, communism's failed. Look at history. It fails for a very specific set of reasons. Communists in the modern era are no different. They are largely hypocrites. The real communists are people like the Amish. The Amish are more communistic than most self-proclaimed communist movements. They actually do manufacture their own goods. They actually do share and share alike to a great degree. They're more communistic, and they're a bunch of zealots. They're a bunch of fundamentalists, and they're more communistic than the average Che Guevara shirt-wearing hippie that you see on your local college campus, which I find slightly amusing. But yeah, a little bit about communism and why I reject it. I don't reject it because the idea behind the communist goals is itself any more horrible than a million other political ideologies. However, those other political ideologies, at sometimes, even like Nazism briefly worked. Of course, then Hitler went nuts, and of course, Germany got clusterfucked on several fronts, which didn't work out too well, but even that worked better than communism did. What does this say about communism? Stalin also had a much higher kill count than Adolf Hitler did, and Mao tops them all. So yeah, if you want to talk about butchery, communism is where it's at because it probably killed several 100 million people throughout the span of a fairly brief history of existence. So it doesn't bode well for communism. That's about all. Peace out.